Today, we rejoin Commander Shepard once again thanks to a full remaster of the Mass Effect trilogy. Dubbed the Legendary Edition, it's complete with a slew of visual upgrades spanning all three games, a truly ambitious all-in-one package that updates developer BioWare's creation for the 4K era, along with updates to its controls. Today, I'm looking at the game as played on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S. Each runs with the PS4 and Xbox One versions, rather than full dedicated next-gen apps, though with unique advantages that still make each the best way to play on console today. How does the remaster compare to the original release? Does the frame rate hold at 4K and 60 FPS on PS5 and Series X as promised? And what of the unique 120Hz mode reported on Series X? Let's buckle into our newly remastered Normandy SR1 and find out. In 2007, Mass Effect invited us into a universe of possibilities, a vast action RPG that lets us freely explore alien worlds. 14 years on, we now have the full trilogy remastered, complete with almost every DLC ever created for the series. Before we get into the comparisons, remaster should be emphasized here rather than remake. According to a blog on its visual upgrades, BioWare states it's using an adapted Unreal Engine 3 rather than migrating to a newer UE4 codebase. In interviews, director Mark Walters explains that the Kismet visual scripting language of UE3 used extensively in Mass Effect just didn't translate directly to UE4. A more fundamental rewrite to Mass Effect's code was needed, one that would have affected too much of the original vision. As a result, the original UE3 engine was adapted to work with more modern tools, letting the team upgrade key points while keeping the core intact. It may be a remaster then, but Legendary Edition ranks among the most impressive remastering projects of the generation so far. The scale of the undertaking here is colossal. You get a major upheaval to visuals, more on this later, but also cleaner UI and a much needed control revamp. The Legendary Edition plumbs deepest into the first Mass Effect in this sense, being the most in need of updating. Controls were improved. The first game now adopts the tighter aiming mechanics of later games, with a smaller reticle and better feedback on bullet impact. It's honestly one of the main reasons to go back today. There is some restraint from BioWare that shows faith to the original design though. Taking cover behind walls is still automatic, for example, rather than using a button press to snap to a wall as in 2 and 3. The context-sensitive cover just isn't as dependable as the sequels, but for balance perhaps it had to stay put.
Nice stuff.
The list of upgrades beyond this is extensive. Bug fixes, gameplay rebalancing, reworked auto-saving points, and loading times that barely last a few seconds on each console. It's all in here. There's a smart launcher interface too on booting the app, letting you resume your last played game in the trilogy. HDR is included, as well as the push to 4K resolutions all round. Today we're focusing on the new console versions, specifically PS5, Xbox Series X and S, showing the best consoles can push to today. All have 4K support, but how they manage it varies by machine. That's 3 games then, across 3 platforms. And what's more, each console has 2 graphics modes, for quality and for frame rate. So there's quite a lot to cover, but before we get to the ins and outs of how each works, let's address the obvious: the Legendary Edition's visual upgrade over the original releases. No analysis of Legendary Edition would be complete without a comparison to the original, so I just had to track down my original Xbox 360 copy of Mass Effect, the best console experience in 2007, outputting at 720p compared to the native 4K experience on Series X. It's no contest obviously. For a start, we're seeing a resolution leap that crosses 2 whole console generations, but the comparison also shows how far BioWare's dialed up other settings. Chief among them really is the textures. Texture mapping is updated across the board in all 3 games, the team stating over 30,000 individual assets are upgraded, some AI upscales, others reworked from scratch. Every surface of each new planet, starting with the lush New Eden here, is replaced to help it hold up to scrutiny at 4K. Of course, Mass Effects 2 and 3 get the same treatment across the board, but this texture upgrade really gets a great showcase on the first game's New Eden mission. It goes all out. Even shaders for grass fuzz, water ripples, and other complex elements are replaced. Check out this spot on the Xbox 360 version. Looking at the ground, there's a shader to simulate grass depth across the floor. Really, it's fine at a distance, but up close it appears very out of focus. In the remaster, we get a sharper texture for this region instead, with more variety too. Grass, dry earth, and even decorative elements like foliage and rocks are thrown in around the same spot, all for good measure. Plus, waterlogged areas now use screen space reflections in the remaster, creating a mirror image for enemies and terrain. It replaces the thick water shader of the original, and it's a clear upgrade. Now, there is a downside to this. Curiously, on Series X and PS5 versions running at 60 FPS, this reflection only updates at 30 FPS, half the refresh, which can look a little jarring in motion. See here, it happens on the water as we pan past it, and also an opening scene in Mass Effect 3. Very odd, and hopefully it can be fixed. Next up, let's talk about the characters. This one really was a must given the number of close-ups in the game. The camera gets extremely close on Shepard during dialogue scenes. It's not simply in the way textures or skin shaders are upgraded either, or even the updated modelling. All those play a huge part, but it's in how light reacts across faces in the remaster. Reworked skin and hair now react logically based on light direction and intensity, giving a more natural diffused look. According to BioWare's blog, which I'd urge you to check out, the remaster doesn't claim to use a physically based model for lighting, but it's still a vast improvement. Materials like skin and plastic react to give more realistic results, backed by high-grade screen space ambient occlusion to fill gaps with shade. It's a vastly higher resolution asset, and it shows throughout the game's huge cast. The upgrades are vast and far-reaching in the remaster. Shadow quality is boosted, geometry tweaked, and we have improved anti-aliasing to support the 4K picture on Series X, S and PS5. Effects are all revamped too. In particular, a nice highlight is the use of volumetrics across this woodland. There's a great sense of depth to this spot, with light cutting through in streaks. Going back to the Xbox 360 original, it looked impressive for its day, but it's rather flat by today's standards. Moving over to the remaster, the art design is completely reworked. The fog, the layer of plants on the floor. It's a radical change for the better, though it's still somehow faithful to the idea of this planet, as a beautiful but horrifying place for the crew to land. All of these asset upgrades amount to one thing: a huge install size for the Legendary Edition. In fact, in European territories, the remaster comes in at 88GB on Xbox Series X and 101GB on PS5 right now, all three combined. It's many times the size of the original 360 games all total together, which comes in at just over 23GB. Now, textures, effects, and shaders only account for a part of this big install. But another big factor is the cutscenes. Many of Mass Effect's cinematics are pre-rendered, and so for the Legendary Edition, we have a re-render of this pre-render, if you like. All are boosted to support 4K, running at 30 frames per second, and support all engine-driven updates in textures, shaders, lighting, and shadows. It's a huge package as a result. Thankfully, EA has thought ahead on this, and you can at least install each game in chunks from that front-end launcher as needed. The good news, Legendary Edition looks identical between PS5, Xbox Series X, and even Series S, though there is a catch for that one. All enjoy the benefits of the upgrades here with little compromise. A three-way comparison shows textures, shadows, lighting, even plant density and screen space effects translate right across. No problem at all. Now I'm running each console on the default quality mode for comparison, which gives us a native 4K image. For PS5 and Series X, this means 4K at 60fps, but you'll notice Series S only runs at 4K and 30fps in this mode. It makes sense given it's pushing a third of the GPU power of Series X in raw teraflop metrics, and all told it's still quite impressive. But yes, the point is, besides the drop to 30fps on Series S, you get the same visual quality from all three, except there are a few catches to this if we get to performance. Okay, so this is where things get interesting. Every console release, including base PS4 and Xbox One, has two modes. One to favour quality and the other for frame rate. Among all of them, the frame rate mode operates at 60fps thanks to a resolution drop. However, Series X has a big advantage by being the only machine listed here with a 120Hz option, once frame rate mode is selected. Yes, that's right, Mass Effects 1, 2 and 3 can run at 120 FPS on Series X, a feature that's missing on even PS5, which for now peaks at 60 FPS. It's worth stressing that there is no official PS5 or Series X release right now, and so these are of course running in back compat mode. On PS5, it's running a native PS4 app, for example. Even so, there are big benefits to using next-gen hardware where frame rate is concerned. So let's kick off with Series X here, to start in its 4K 60 quality mode. Series X in quality mode then. It does exactly what it says, rendering at a native 3840 by 2160 and handing in 60 FPS without missing a beat. It runs flawlessly from my testing so far. Now, a disclaimer here, covering so many games across all three consoles with 2 modes to check on each, my sample size has been limited to the opening few hours. Still, the outlook in this new Eden area is hugely positive on the Series X. Comparatively speaking, this is the strongest 4K 60 performer of the next-gen consoles. Interestingly, it does appear dynamic resolution scaling is used on consoles as a way to help lock at 60 FPS. It's rarely in evidence on Series X here, though I have seen a sample on PS5 go down to 1944p during frame rate drops. Still, a really impressive showing for Series X in all 3 games. Next we have the frame rate mode on Series X. Getting 120Hz this way is entirely unique to the X console. Before we get to the metrics though, it's worth saying the visual difference between quality and frame rate modes is mostly in resolution, with a drop to 2560 by 1440. It's expected given the doubling in frame rate in Series X's case, though ambient occlusion also takes a hit in the process. The SSAO setting is lowered, and if we switch between the two, you can see here thicker and less precise contours on plants in the bottom right. This is the only change in sight, and applies for PS5 and Series S frame rate modes as well, which also drop to 1440p. Getting 120 FPS seems like a real coup for Series X on paper. The catch? Well, the delivery isn't as solid as I'd hoped, especially in the first Mass Effect's opener. Okay, you can get stretches of play at 120 FPS, but crucial locations like the Citadel fly up and down between 80 and 120 FPS. Even the new Eden mission struggles to rise above 100 FPS for crucial battles. I will say that the first Mass Effect goes extremely heavy on volumetric effects early on. It's a taxing way to start the game. For me though, it's simply too variable on fixed refresh displays, though Series X's VRR function will certainly help if your TV supports it. Fortunately, Mass Effect 2 and 3's opening segments fly without similar issues. In fact, barring a crashing reading in Mass Effect 3's intro cutscene, most of the big set-piece battles later on fly by without issue. There are a few uneven spots in Mass Effect 2 as well, but so far at least nothing as drastic as the first game. The 120Hz mode is a neat bonus to have overall then, but be warned, it does have its rough points. Next along then, we have Series S. Again, we return to the quality mode, this time dropping us to 4K at 30 frames per second. This is V-synced and runs pretty much flawlessly so far, that is with a key exception on the New Eden level of the first game. Performance gets steadily better across all 3 games, but in this particular woodland shootout, filling the screen with alpha effects tips the Series S into the 20 to 30 FPS region. Again, this is a really big stress test for the engine. It's an outlier and later areas, including the Citadel, run flawlessly. And of course, the opening set pieces in the 2 sequels have barely a hitch on Series S. All round, the 4K 30 quality mode is well worth using for visual purists. It's very workable for a majority of the time. Just be warned, it does have potential to lurch under in extreme cases. Of course, there is an alternative. Series S's frame rate mode is the one to try for 60 FPS gameplay. As mentioned, you drop to 1440p to get a 60Hz refresh. Curiously, this uses an adaptive V-Sync this time, and so when it does drop, you get full screen tearing to help minimize the impact. Now, this isn't entirely without fault either. It's mostly a solid 60, but you can see drops into the 50s. You get flashes of tearing and sub 60 FPS drops around the Citadel, as well as when using the grenade launcher in Mass Effect 2 and other battles later on. Performance hits are rare, though still jarring after coming from the fluid Series X version. On the whole, it's still a solid release that at least gives 30 and 60 FPS options, though each is prone to drops at points across the trilogy. Last of all, we have the game on PS5. This of course runs in a back-compat plus mode. It's a native PS4 app, but embellished with a higher frame rate than last gen. Specifically, in quality mode, that means it runs at 4K 60fps rather than the 4K 30 we have on Pro, and it's a true native 4K too. In action, it mostly hits that 60fps target, though it must be said it isn't as smooth as Series X's quality mode at the same settings. PS5 simply has more hitching, one-off frame drops as you roam the Citadel, something we never see on Series X. In Battle 2 you can see more variable frame rates once alpha effects are involved, 55 to 60fps readings in brief, rare bursts. Perhaps the lowest I've seen it go is in Mass Effect 3 with this opening cutscene leading to a huge explosion. It's quite rough, but it is outside gameplay as well. Across the breadth of the three games, it largely holds true to 60fps though. It's just not the 100% perfect reading to match the Xbox equivalent. The other last base to cover here is PS5 in the framerate mode, which is missing the 120Hz output. With framerate selected, it's just 1440p at 60fps, dropping the res from 4K. At least this smooths out the combat drops we see in PS5's quality mode, but to go back to that Mass Effect 3 cutscene drop, that's still quite a glaring one. By brute force of lowering the memory bandwidth requirements in resolution, Alpha no longer incurs any major hits for framerate during battle at least. It's one workaround, but honestly not a necessary one, and I'd really recommend sticking with the quality mode at 4K. It's a better compromise between visuals and performance, though again it's a Series X lead in overall consistency. Mass Effect Legendary Edition is a marked success in modernising a trilogy, and 14 years on from release, the scale of this remaster is staggering. It's not just the visuals, but how it makes each game more playable, UI changes and control tweaks included. It's a perfect jumping on point for the series if you missed the boat on release, and equally, it's just great to see 4K 60 as an option on Series X and PS5 out the gate. Perhaps with a few refinements here, that refresh can be locked down on the Series S and PS5 versions, but it's mostly a win in its delivery. How the other machines and PC fare is another story for another day perhaps, but after covering every game in the trilogy across 3 platforms and 2 modes, that's about all I have time for today. If you did enjoy this tech breakdown, please feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with myself or the rest of the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.